Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I look forward to a very interesting afternoon. We have a lot of competition, first of all from the weather, but also from the fact that there are two other conservative events occurring at this time, and we're having to share an audience with them. But I'm delighted to see you here, and I look forward to an afternoon on a topic of great importance. I would say not simply great importance, but importance the knowledge of which is emerging gradually. Those of you, I think quite a lot in this audience, who read the British press, will have seen, for example, the last few days in the Daily Telegraph, a dramatically interesting series by the journalist Stephen Edgington, showing the degree to which the civil service, including some of its most senior members, has been, so to speak, taken over by a previously either unknown or misunderstood wokeness tendency. Wokeness we're all very aware of in the American context, but we don't expect to find it in the context of the senior ranks of the British civil service. And yet it's clear that this has been, in the last few years, quietly proceeding under our radar. Now, it first emerged not with Mr. Edgington's articles, but with the dramatic news that Nigel Farage, who is probably the leading member of the unofficial bourgeois resistance of the British people to this kind of thing, when he revealed that his was originally revealed by the BBC that he had been debanked. He was to lose his account at Coutts Bank. Coutts Bank is an extremely famous bank. The late Queen complained that she thought its financial solvency was threatened by the Queen Mother's account. But in general, you can take it for granted that in order to be a client of Coutts Bank, you have to be both rich and, I think, to some extent, influential in a wider sense. Farage undoubtedly fit those two requirements. Why therefore was he debanked? Why was he fired by his bank? Well, he might have been frightened and embarrassed into silence when the news broke on the BBC. The news was given to a BBC reporter at a dinner in the city by the chairman of the parent bank, NatWest. Not the chairman, I'm sorry, but the CEO of the parent bank, NatWest, Dame Alison Rose. She shouldn't have given that information about a bank customer. It's absolutely against any reasonable banking principles, but she did. And the BBC was only too delighted to broadcast it because the BBC is a representative of that establishment, which has become progressive in recent years and is therefore halfway to being woke itself. Farage himself at that point might have, as I say, been kind of embarrassed into silence and slunk away. That's not his way. And what he did was he went on the attack. He forced them to reveal the reasons, which when they were revealed proved to be highly political. And not only political, but also, of course, in large elements false. But the real thing was to say that he did not fit the picture of what a client of Coutts should be, because he was seen as being too right-wing, a man who'd supported UKIP, had led UKIP and supported Brexit, and generally had proved to be, as I say, the anti-progressive leading figure in British politics. Well, when he fought back, he did something amazing, really. He won. And he won in the sense that, first of all, Dame Alison Rose had to resign. She had to resign. And secondly, the bank the NatWest has been acutely embarrassed ever since. But Farage has gone on to make this a crusade, not for himself, but for other people who've been debanked. And That's very interesting. Why is debunking suddenly something that banks do, and why is it effective? Why is it? Well, the answer is if you don't have a bank account, you're cut off from a great deal of everyday life in the modern world. You can't receive certain forms of payment, you can't make certain forms of payment, and you are generally in a difficult situation. Now, we've invited a distinguished academic. Our guest is a former professor of politics at Bradford University, and he is currently emeritus and living in Scotland. His native Lake District. I thought, okay, well, living in northwest England, which is not as foreign to the south of England as Scotland, but is foreign in some respects all the same. I speak as somebody from Liverpool. Well, Professor Gallagher is the author of 15 books, one which has received a great deal of admiring attention, I think, including from people who don't generally share his outlook, is his recent biography of Antonio Salazar, the former leader of Portugal. But most recently, he has a book which I will now hold up, which I hope we are going to be excerpting in the Hungarian Review and the Hungarian Conservative. It is Europe's Leadership Famine, and it's a series of essays about why, in the post-war world, Europe has proved to be deficient in strong, effective political leadership. Those of us who have discovered Professor Gallagher through his work also tended to become faithful followers of his on Twitter, where he is a strong and reliably effective opponent of political nonsense. So he's going to address this extremely important and all of a sudden new and threatening topic, and I look forward to hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much, John. I'm really delighted to be here today as the guest of the Danube Institute. Extended thanks to John O'Sullivan, Melissa O'Sullivan, and other people for this invitation. John has been a persistent and tenacious defender of the conservative position in politics in all seasons, and I'm glad to see that he continues to fire on all cylinders. I think he sensed that I was likely to beam a harsh light on the governing ethos of Britain right now. The book that he kindly drew to your attention is mainly continental in its focus, but I have commented on social media about the rapid erosion of the pillars of stability that helped support a 340-year system of usually pragmatic governance in Britain. My remarks will focus on the recent drive to reconfigure power at the heart of the British state, replacing norms and conventions that preserved equilibrium in an increasingly complex society with new ones meant to engineer a sweeping revolt against the past. But first I will look at what were the sources of British stability and why they have been comprehensively challenged from within. The historian Alan Taylor called the network of people and institutions with power and influence who rule the country the establishment. For most of the time since the establishment in 1688 of a limited monarchy increasingly subordinate to Parliament, the networks of power comprising the ruling elite have extolled pragmatism, favoured neutrality over ideological impositions. Bourgeois political revolutions, religious wars were seen as un-English, or at least as afflictions that Britain, after the 1707 Union of England and Scotland, had overcome. There was no lack of admiration for British exceptionalism. For example, who has heard of Thomas Kremer, a Hungarian-speaking Transylvanian, a Jew, who was a successful games inventor businessman, invented the Rubik Cube, lived in England for 50 years. He believed long-established patterns of thought in England shaped its constitutional order. I quote, "In a nutshell, English philosophical tradition leans towards empirical evidence, prefers a pragmatic approach, and above all draws heavily on the archetypal British characteristic of common sense. On the continent, the tendency has been to proceed from abstract first principle, construct coherent systems, and accommodate perceived reality within a logical, unified universe. It is aesthetically more satisfying, though practically less relevant." Now, in places without Britain's long good fortune, a self-restraining elite distrusting ideological agendas, valuing a spirit of compromise was admired. British political and legal culture evolved to produce a society in which the state and the individual seemed to enjoy equity, parity of esteem. But in stages after 1945, a radically different perspective gained ground. British decision makers became unnerved by different setbacks. Suez Crisis of 1956, industrial strife, chronic unrest in Northern Ireland, to name but a few. This led in 1973 to a momentous decision to join what became later the European Union. Not least, it involved subsuming British laws with those in the EU, springing essentially from a centralising French tradition. A bureaucratic and increasingly left-leaning intelligentsia has shaped the expansion of EU power. The past 50 years have seen a succession of visionary projects in Brussels that require endorsement. I would contend net zero is undoubtedly the key one. In Britain, it has come to be viewed as the most significant national undertaking since the Second World War. It got its baptism with Labour's Climate Change Act in 2008, massively advanced by Prime Minister May in 2019, no debate in Parliament, committing Britain to zero carbon emissions by 2050. Not just on climate issues, but increasingly on health matters, an outsourcing of policy to technocratic supranational bodies has occurred. In what has rapidly become a post-national elite, validation from expansionary global bodies is more important than, say, recognition from the British monarchy. So business in Britain has become increasingly detached from the country. Just one small vignette, perhaps you will regard it as trivial. The late Queen Elizabeth celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, 60 years on the throne. The Crown had difficulty in raising millions in sponsorship needed to running costs and security. Business kept its hands in its pockets. And in the end, it was only a consortium of Chinese Hong Kong business people and a few Swedes who rescued the day. This is a time, the first years of our century, when a rigid social justice orthodoxy became entrenched in private and public organisations, institutions across British society. In business, entrepreneurship has ceded vital ground to the drive to remodel society along woke lines, as shown by the rise of diversity, inclusion, sustainability officers in so many companies. In a new climate of conformity, the worldview of those promoting a progressive agenda designed to rewire humanity is not to be challenged. The sceptical view of much of the country still towards this new departure is dismissed as backward, such as opposition, for instance, to the drive for a cashless society. The quasi-religious certainty fueling this top-down crusade has allowed surveillance, cancellation, other forms of social and economic punishment to become permissible. Many reasons for this. One that shouldn't be overlooked, in my view, is that corporations have become used to the easy life. Charles Moore recently pointed out how, and I quote, banks went off the rails in the dangerously elongated era of low interest rates, giddy with the rescue that quantitative easing gave them after 2008. In the desperate search for yield, encouraged by people like Larry Fink of BlackRock, they tried to monetize virtue. Hence their excitement over ESG, environmental, social, and governance. The attractions of this are obvious. Going woke is actually easier than being good at business. Why bother with what Elon Musk calls a hardcore work culture if playing politics is all it takes to be a great tycoon? So the idea has grown an appeal of making NGO activism behind a crusading social objective the new business model. Alistair Heath, editor of the Sunday Telegraph, wrote in July, "The woke corporation, it turns out, is in fact the lazy, decadent corporation. Social activism is a cover for managerial inadequacy. Pandering to the prejudices of a vocal minority of staff is less demanding than delivering profits." Until, as John mentioned, the amateurs at NatWest Bank took on a professional like Nigel Farage and were eaten alive. So from poor service to a failure to grasp technology, a reticence to support small businesses, the British banking world has turned into a lazy oligopoly. Let me turn now to the civil service. It has grown even more ideological for not dissimilar reasons. Promotion is likelier, faster, and easier by playing progressive politics rather than being a sound administrator. Let me give you two contrasting interventions separated by over 40 years to show the shift in the civil service culture. 1979, Mrs. Thatcher about to become Prime Minister, David Owen, still the Foreign Secretary, and his ambassador in Washington, Sir Nicholas Henderson, wrote a famous memorandum saying how difficult it is to be an effective diplomat when the rest of the world regards Britain as having squandered its power. 2023, Simon Macdonald, now Lord Macdonald, the head of the Foreign Office, interviewed, indifferent or reconciled to British decline. His principal concern, planetary issues, the fate of Little Britain, irrelevant. The situation has been reached in which the civil servants now openly threaten to strike or leak against ministers who pursue policies which have been democratically endorsed by voters, but which the blob dislikes. What's that, the blob? Well, it's also been called the unelected permanent blob, described as the nexus of mandarins, senior civil servants, policy advisors, quangocrats, other government agents, a class of public servants who don't really like the public and are increasingly convinced that they have a constitutional duty to constrain and contain elected politicians. I need some water. So, activists seeking to achieve capture of institutions, both private and public, by agitation through online communications and more covert means, have enjoyed a huge breakthrough. John mentioned the great work by Steve Edgington, which led to 40 senior civil servants writing to their boss in alarm at how fast the woke takeover is occurring. You have had a flood of graduates from social sciences, humanities, whose main knowledge acquired after university has been about the illegitimate systems of power in Britain and how to delegitimize and deconstruct those systems. And they are rising rapidly to the top. They are united by the theory of intersectionality. Many of you will know that already that this is a cocktail of classical economic Marxism, radical feminism, post-colonial theory, queer theory, and critical race theory. The aim is to capture institutions with a new, supposedly progressive design for the modern world. It began in North America, which means, unfortunately, that England, Britain is highly susceptible, displaying the appearance of tolerance and diversity, but minus the substance, and turning the state bureaucracy into an ideological safari park, a dream come true for those with a defective work culture who prefer to work from home and will only come into the office to engage in ideological struggle sessions. So, unsurprisingly, backing for the outsourcing of policy to technocratic supranational bodies from this new civil service elite. After 43 years in the EU, the civil servants lost the ability to negotiate for Britain. Key elite figures dislike Britain and are ready to injure those in public life whose concerns are still British-focused ones. John very neatly summed up the saga of Nigel Farage and the NatWest Bank, so I don't need to mention them. The humdrum role of keeping his money, lending him money, perhaps giving him financial advice, was not enough for these bankers. They saw themselves as guardians of a new moral order based supposedly on diversity and inclusiveness. Labour, the Labour Party, is relaxed about the newfound moralising of the corporate moguls. This is ironic. Many on the left who had spent 15 years bashing the banks as the source of every economic woe lapped up the Coutts spin and said that the closure of Farage's account was an entirely financial decision. This is ominous, as the left seems, at the moment anyway, poised to be swept back into power in Britain. So it's astonishing that Britain is in the vanguard of efforts by powerful corporations to dispossess citizens because of wrong think. For a long time, this was a freer place. Britain was a freer place than many of its democratic counterparts. Increasingly, this is no longer true. NGO-led scoring schemes such as the Corporate Equality Index, UK-based diversity champions, menace those businesses that fail to conform to the new orthodoxy with reputational risk blackmailing and deplatforming. The astonishing switch of the elite towards being didactic and highly ideological and restrictive, if not coercive, should also be seen as a consequence of profound shifts in state and society. The establishment became much narrower in Britain due to the retreat of religion, the shrivelling of many communities, large and small, the replacement of light and manufacturing industry by the high-tech information economy, not just a proliferating bureaucracy, but a vast swathe of semi-state bodies, charities, not to mention the universities, publicly funded media outlets, came to comprise a new establishment. We have a new and different establishment now in Britain. This constellation of power grew in strength, not only because of the vast increase in public spending, but because those who carried weight were increasingly uniform in their outlook. They had been exposed to new left thinking over the previous 50 years and were post-national and post-modern in outlook. I think the 2008 Equality Act is of profound importance. It laid down that the primary purpose of government was to equalize outcomes between sexes, races, groups with different sexual cultures or preferences, the disabled, and other disadvantaged groups. The unexpected decision of the EU to leave, Britain to leave the EU in 2016 substantially radicalized many in what was now a cohesive left liberal establishment. If a book written on European traumas in the last 150 years, then this 2016 earthquake would be up there with the fall of France, the assassination of JFK, as a major disturbance in the national elite psyche. For a large section of the British middle class, Brexit has become the default explanation of everything that has gone wrong with the country, and quite often in their own lives. One crucial outcome is the rejection by influential segments of British society of the democratic ethos developed after the great voting reforms of the 19th, early 20th centuries. What is democracy if not at heart the right to disagree with those who hold power in society? Not many in influential positions ever wish to repudiate this underlying principle now, but this is increasingly happening. It's no longer unacceptable to dismiss the views of ordinary voters out of hand, the need to prevent the primitive views of the majority deciding the fate of the nation. And it is increasingly acceptable to devise coercive measures, to put them into place and recognize that the views of the ruling few once again must prevail. Now, John here has recently shown how in Britain laws and regulations are being increasingly delegated by MPs to agencies and bureaucrats, and it's no surprise that they deeply dislike non-compliance with measures over ecological issues that further increase the sway of the administrative state. Parliament has surrendered its sovereignty, first to an unaccountable bureaucracy based in Brussels, a measure partly reversed in 2016, but under Prime Ministers May, Johnson and Sunak, it has allowed harsh criminal sentences to be imposed on those who resist social and economic change that only a minority of citizens actually really want. Post-democracy is being imposed not by the dangerous reactionary right, but by a supposedly enlightened left dominated by assertive liberals. Nominal conservatives like Theresa May now openly endorse the accelerating groupthink. Encouraged by the media, civil service, rigid social justice orthodoxy is becoming entrenched in private and public organizations and right across the whole of society. May is the type of dim conformist who is quite prepared to make her peace with authoritarianism so as to enjoy a quiet and materially fulfilling life. Why do I harp on about this nullity? Well, her craven attitude is shared by not a few people in the armed forces, yes, in the armed forces, in big business, sports management, who have become converts to coercive liberalism. Some admittedly go down this road with a heavy heart, fearful of the consequences if they do not bow to the new order. But what counts for many is that they are near the centres of power, irrespective of the ideology being advanced. Thus, many filling positions in the new British establishment are essentially opportunists, transactional. Perhaps this could even be said of a number of high-profile members of the British royal family. Other ex-prime ministers or party leaders, desperate to remain relevant, have also endorsed the view that turning Britain into the lead nation of the Green Revolution is so imperative that debate about who pays where the technology for it exists is actually unnecessary. So back to Thomas Kremer. He wrote a very good neglected book, which he had to publish himself in 2005, called The Missing Heart of Europe. And he complained about concentric countries in Europe, which he counterposed to Britain, how they rewrite the constitution, scrap their political institutions, abandon their laws with remarkable ease, monotonous regularity. For them to adopt new laws, have yet another constitution imposed upon them is no big deal. But this is the point that Britain's autocratic delirium has now come to. The mainstream parties closing ranks make it far easier for policies to be decided and imposed over the heads of the British people. Kremer wrote about a Britain he assumed still existed 20 years ago. Power is more widely shared through British society. Its sources are diffuse. The centre itself, despite recent Thatcherite and Blairite tendencies, is less than monolithic. The value placed on individual rights and liberties, on the diversity of personal choice, on invention, enterprise, spontaneity, the tolerance of nonconformity, attitudes of irreverence towards external authority, are all hallmarks of an eccentric as opposed to a concentric society. But all that's gone. An extraordinary disempowerment of the electorate has occurred. People smuggling gangs, bringing tens of thousands of illegal immigrants, have some of their staunchest allies among liberal left judges and activist law firms. And this change, this disruption, for many in the elite is far less troubling than subordinate people in the lower orders failing to know their place. The positions that they endorse on open borders, climate, gender identity, race, are not ones likely to produce a stable political order. The new bundle of fashionable Wake nostrums face rejection from much of society. As we know, determined radicals at the centre of power, trying to impose incoherent, unpopular ideas on the rest of society, have periodically sprung up in mainland Europe with often unhappy results. Britain finally may now be experiencing the quasi-revolutionary spirit, which gave rise to waves of continental instability that for centuries many on the island assumed they were safely immune from. The chief mistake of those in the driving seat, I think, is increasingly they are unable to conceal their dislike for the views of many of the majority of their fellow citizens, and they resent the democratic constraints, which mean that these people have to be occasionally deferred to. So we may now be confronting, and I'm coming to the end, the decay and breakdown of a long-established political order. A pact had been worked out after 1688 between a powerful parliament, noble oligarchs, and the monarch who kept control of the executive. This compact put down sturdy roots thanks to a spirit of compromise, enabling the equilibrium to become institutionalized with various adjustments. British elites now display little sense of public duty. They dodge, deny responsibility for their failures, no matter how serious. They're more concerned with protecting their image than with serving the public good. Words I have borrowed from the academic James Woodison. I don't have any time, but I was going to compare the attitude of Stanley Baldwin, probably the figure most responsible for keeping Britain stable between the two wars, and the political career elite that we now have. He donated 20% of his fortune, worth about £33 million today, to pay off the debt at the end of the First World War and relieve poor taxpayers of their burden. And he insisted this must be done anonymously, word must never get out. Today, there is little left of this desire to be of service to a greater cause than that of career fulfillment. Instead, a chronic imbalance has occurred as a political class no longer enjoying noticeable popular backing fades. Instead, power is concentrated in the upholders of an administrative state, current allies in the world of corporate economic power. This is a recipe for conflict, as Britain has long ceased to be economically robust or socially stable. Figures with Baldwin's ethos ensured that Britain remained largely untouched by the political polarization which gripped much of pre-1939 Europe. Arguably today in Britain, there are far more potent forces corroding democratic freedom. They are not bubbling up on the fringes of society, but are being driven by the state itself and its corporate adjuncts. So with much regret, I have to say that Britain has become one of the main nerve centres in the world for destructive groupthink based on promoting niche ideas which are a recipe for chaos and fragmentation. It didn't happen overnight, but has had a long gestation process stretching over 50 years, and it has greatly accelerated in a few short years. However much stability Britain once enjoyed, and indeed is still known for, it is condemning itself to the endless troubles which it once deplored in other places near and far. History shows that countries which repudiate the best in their past and embrace a future of irrational experimentation can't escape the consequences of their foolish action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to resume your seat? I will.
Sure.
And thank you very much indeed. That was a marvellous talk, and I'm very grateful to you for it. Before I ask Steve Hayward to respond and begin a debate, I want to say that I should have, of course, introduced one or two people in the audience whom I neglected to do so, and I will now make good that. First of all, I'd like to welcome the distinguished Portuguese ambassador, Dr. Jorge Oliveira. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Now, we also have three new fellows at the Institute who are here for the next few months, and I want to welcome them by name. Perhaps I could ask David Satter, who is a distinguished journalist, formerly Financial Times correspondent in Moscow, and the author, of course, of very distinguished works, including a film about the last days of the Soviet Union, which we will be showing later in the fall. Secondly, just arrived today, Dr. Stephen Klimchuk-Masson from Canada, the author of a book on a related topic, actually, namely Kanzuk, namely the relations between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And we look forward to your work on that. And finally, our third fellow is about to respond to our speaker, and that is Stephen Hayward, who is the author of a massive and interesting two-volume work on the age of Reagan, a biography of a distinguished American conservative who was a somewhat neglected figure outside of America, but nonetheless important there, Stanton Evans. And I think, but I don't know what it is you're working on at the moment.
I don't either.
Okay. Well, I think you've been working on your remarks too. So let me ask you to respond, and then resume your seat, and then we'll have a wider conversation. Okay. Steve Hayward.
Well, I don't know, John and ladies and gentlemen, if I'll spark much debate because I'm in heated agreement with everything Professor Gallagher said. So I was taking furious notes on my reporter's notebook. I've gone back to the old form of my youth. So I think I'll just make a couple of observations on just 2 key points. And then I've got many more pages of notes, but we'll, I think, have more fun in discussion. We began, of course, with the instance of the debunking of Nigel Farage in England, and then from there brought in the current enthusiasm for ESG, environmental safety and governance guidelines for investment in business and so forth. And I'm now old enough to remember when this all went by a different name. Here I should pause and say, the professor used a phrase about, these days we are being driven by determined radicals. John and I have a mutual friend, Michael Walsh, who has a slogan about this. He says, the thing to know about the left is they never sleep, they never stop, they never quit. And they can't be effectively countered unless our team does the same. And so back in the 70s, the enthusiasm to try and bend private capital in the business world to the agenda of the left was called corporate social responsibility, CSR. It used to go by that abbreviation. And then at some point after that, a phrase that meant exactly the same thing as ESG, this was about 20 years ago, it was called for a while in corporate speak, the triple bottom line. And I'm embarrassed that I've forgotten what the 3 parts are, because I actually wrote an article about it for Forbes magazine about how dumb it was and how contrary to true business principles it is. But that didn't really catch on. At the same time, we had sustainable development. Some of you might remember that who are old enough. And the problem with that phrase is it was so watery and imprecise and vague that even after the Clinton administration had a presidential commission on sustainable development, after generating reams of paper and big, thick reports, that phrase it's still around a little, but it got dropped, mostly dropped. And then we have ESG, and then its evil spawn, net zero. Separately, I think actually a project I'm working on for Danube is the road to net zero and the road out of it, if there is one. Net zero is a great fraud, really, and I can go through why, and I won't now, but the word net carries lots of potential for mischief. Right? And I'll give you one example. As everyone knows, it pays attention to this whole world. China, in the next 2 years, will build more new coal-fired power plants than the entire existing coal fleet of the United States, which is still pretty substantial. We've shut down a lot of coal plants, but we still have, I think, 400 of them. And of course, at any point in life, people would have said you can't build. The environmentalists hate coal above any other form of energy. They hate the other ones too, but they really hate coal. But Reuters last week tipped the whole game. They had a long story about how, really it's okay if China builds all these coal plants because they're going to use it to build electric cars and solar panels that will save the world. The math doesn't pencil out at all, but you can see where the creative accounting, if you know the American story, Enron-style accounting is going to come into play here. And the international agencies will declare China to be in compliance because they will face the reality that China has no intention of cutting back on their energy growth because they need it for their own growth. Okay, so that hypocrisy is going to go on, and lots of other lying will happen. I could go through American examples. I'll skip over all that now. But the debunking issue, to get back to that, there has been a push for it in the United States. ESG was don't invest in fossil fuels. And for a while, and I have 2 very good friends of mine who are small-time players. When you talk about the domestic oil and gas industry in America, if you call someone a small-time player, that means they're not yet billionaires. I have 2 friends of mine who've done very well in the business. They're not billionaires, but they both have their own private jets. Okay, and they said, yes, this has actually raised our cost of capital and make it more difficult to do business. Some banks have already drawn back from that. The CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, was brought before a congressional hearing, and I forget who it was. It was some crazy left-wing member of the House said, are you still loaning money to fossil fuel companies? He said, yes. I said, why aren't you stopping? And he said, to his credit, that would be the road to madness for the United States. And so a lot of banks have not ceased. They say they're going to be ESG investors, but they haven't really done it. So this has improved a little bit. And then separately, a lot of pressure brought on banks to debank the gun industry. people who make rifles and handguns and also ammunition. And, in America, guns are a big issue. And that has not really caught on. I don't know. There may have been a couple of banks who said, yeah, we're going to cut back on extending credit to gun companies. But one difference between the United States and Britain, I think, is that we are nationally chartered banks and our state banks. And so I'll bet if we look, what you'd find is there are lots of state banks in, Texas, that's probably happy to do a credit business with the gun industry. So we'll see. I think ESG is already, even Larry Fink, who was mentioned, has drawn back a bit from his prior rhetorical enthusiasm for ESG. And if you look at what mutual fund companies and the big finance capital firms do, they've decided maybe we're not going to get out of fossil fuels, which, by the way, was the best performing sector on the American stock market in 2021. So no one really wants to be left out of that party. And by the way, Vanguard, one of their biggest mutual fund companies, said, we're not going to go along with this. For them, it was a simple reason. They do these index funds, and they're very low cost. They're very good for small investors to put their retirement accounts in and so forth. And their problem is they can't actually run an honest index fund unless they're invested in all sectors. So for them, it was a necessity to say, we're not going to follow these rigid ESG guidelines, environmental. So the point is there are certain ways in which this is already collapsing, but like Michael Walsh says, the left is going to come back. There'll be a new term. I'm not sure what it will be when net zero becomes the obvious fraud. And that may take 10 or 15 years. They'll be back with something else and keep going. The second thing that particularly struck me is Professor Gallagher mentioned briefly, or made reference to our administrative state around the world now has two things that drive it. One is the pretense of scientific expertise. We saw this really go wrong with COVID. And second, especially in America, we have the legal structure that has allowed so much effective lawmaking to be transferred to unelected officials. Now, in the old days, this is a very broad generalization that would require more development, but I'll state it briefly here by saying in the old days, the permanent civil service in England, the kind that's dramatized so well in the old Yes Minister episodes, they may have had a certain self-interest. Public choice theory will teach you that, of course. But I think it is fair to say that for large part, and this gets to the pragmatism you mentioned, they govern within the bounds of public consent. And today, they don't do that. I think the most glaring aspect of the American civil service, our permanent civil service, and the British one is that they're contemptuous of the consent of the public. But then Professor Gallagher mentioned something broader than those particular aspects of the matter, which was, I think the phrase you used was this post-national, post-modern era we live in. And I'll just dilate that a little bit by saying how significant I think this is. The post-national viewpoint, which dislikes the nation state, why do the post-national left dislike the nation state? Because it's an obstacle to the centralization of power and the extension of their agenda. And then postmodernism, this is a phrase I'm kind of tired of. It's kind of broad and watery, and there's a lot of jargon attached to it. There's one part of it that's quite astonishing. It used to be conservatives didn't like the rationality of the Enlightenment. Today, it's the postmodern left that attacks Enlightenment reason as a tool of capitalism, as a tool in America, a tool of white supremacy. And suddenly it's conservatives like me who are saying, wait a minute, let's not be so hasty about throwing out the Enlightenment. and we're defending it now. And why is it important to attack the tradition of reason? Old-fashioned logical reasoning, which you can trace back forever? Well, because that places a limit on the emancipation of the will and the willfulness of the left to say, well, you can think of your own examples of human nature that doesn't exist anymore. I've made jokes over the years that if we're not going to use reason, pretty soon people will be doing interpretive dance to communicate. You're laughing. Maybe you saw the story out of London a few days ago, right? If you didn't see this, there was a group in London that is a group that wants to rejoin the European Union, the rejoiners. And they put on a protest outside the Houses of Parliament that consisted of interpretive dance. out in the streets. I thought, wow, that's going to persuade people. Gosh, I was a Brexiteer till I saw that interpretive dance. And now I really, but this is where we are. It's there's an deliberate embrace of irrationality of the kind you thought would have died along with the phrase existentialism that we used to use. There's a whole lot more I can say about this. I can tell you the story of being seated with Oliver Morton, an editor for The Economist in San Francisco, having dinner the night the Brexit vote came in and watching his eyes get big after he'd assured me at the beginning of dinner, no way it's going to pass. It's just slammed. There's no possible way it'll pass. And that was a fun moment. And it was the first moment where I thought, I'll bet that Trump guy is going to win after all. So there we go. Thank you.
Well, I think we've had two terrific presentations, and I'm going to ask one question of both speakers and then throw it open to the floor. And the question is, both of you gentlemen are heavily implicated in academic life. And it does appear to outsiders like me that much of the explanation for the trends you've described is that the universities became places in which places of indoctrination in a new set of ideas, which explains the fact that all over the Western world, after a time lag, all of a sudden people with this set of ideas, which have been described by both of you, postmodernism and I would say post-rational thought in some ways, both of you described how these trends have now suffused society. Well, is that an accurate and large, and is it a sufficient account of what happened, explanation of what's happened, and what can we do about it if that is the case? Professor Gallagher. Oh, you've got a microphone.
Right, you have that microphone.
Sure, you have to use it for the television. Yeah.
Well, at the end of the Second World War, the universities were respected, but they weren't a powerful central element in the power structure. But with the growth of prosperity, with the decline of other institutions, with the recognition by political entrepreneurs like Blair that universities could be used to manipulate, indoctrinate impressionable young people, and therefore create a future voting bank. They grew more significant. I think the biggest mystery is the failure of the Conservatives to do anything about it. I mean, in my first institution, Mrs. Thatcher sent a couple of her backbenchers, Cranley, Onslow is one that springs to mind, to try and defang peace studies in Bradford. I think they were mainly exercised by pro-Palestinian person, and they were just so timid, so amateur that they gave up. They gave up the ghost, I think it's an act of pure masochism that the Conservatives continue to plough huge amounts of research money into cartels in the soft subjects, which are completely dominated by left-wing people and who distribute the goodies among themselves. There's just a lack of self-belief on the part of Conservatives, but I've said enough.
Yes.
Well,
Steve.
One of the ironies is that universities in America, and I think in Britain also, love to talk about diversity. And of course, what diversity now means is people in America especially, is everybody looks different but thinks the same. There's less and less true diversity of opinion and methodology, by the way, that's a long story, in American universities. And there's lots of empirical data about how faculties, where conservatives were always a minority, but were always a critical mass, have been declining like crazy. So now there's one opinion on campuses. And I think the person who has the best analysis of why this has become such a big problem and spilled out from the universities is actually one of the smartest left-of-center thinkers in America. It's the law professor Cass Sunstein at Harvard. And he's written some really interesting material on what he calls the dominance of conformity. Now, everyone's heard of groupthink, of course, but he goes through the social science of this, and that's pretty precise. And what it shows is when like-minded people only deliberate with other like-minded people, especially in bureaucracies, in universities, they tend to become more radicalized. And so then the final piece of the puzzle is, I used to think, well, who cares if they wreck all the English departments in American universities? Might not be a bad price to pay to keep crazy people off the street. The problem is, gender studies, all the rest, all these things broke out of the university and got into the human resources departments of major corporations and other places. That I never saw coming. I thought this would be confined to the campus, and it was for a very long time. But now it's like a virus that's escaped the campus. And so what can be done? Well, I'll just say that there are finally some efforts in the U.S. to push back against this, at least with public universities, at least in red states like Florida and Texas, where they've passed some measures of varying degrees of, I think, design quality to push back against the lack of intellectual diversity. And in Texas, simply said, and a couple other places, we're just going to abolish all these diversity offices in university bureaucracies, which exist for no other purpose than to harass the faculty and the students.
And have they succeeded in actually abolishing those bureaucracies?
In a couple places, a lot of them are simply renaming themselves, like I suggested, and going to ground. So to be continued.
Okay, thank you. Now, some questions from the floor. Do I see anybody? Yes, gentleman here. Oh.
Yes, a second.
Thank you, John. I read an article that you wrote in the National Review magazine about the failure of the Tory party, the Conservative Party. And I think you, as well as the members of the panel, can address this too, because the last time we had a non-Tory prime minister was in 2009, and that was like a decade and a half ago. So what are some of the ways that the British Conservatives have failed to, be conservatives?
Well, I will answer that, but I'm going to invite our two speakers to answer it first. First, Tom.
Well, I think David Cameron and George Osborne were pivotal figures in the recent story of the Conservative Party, and they systematically encouraged basically liberal types veering a bit towards the left to come into the party, fast-tracked into electable seats. And they have been, leading the drive to blunt any opposition to the climate agenda and other things. The Conservative Party despises its grassroots members and tries to ensure that they have as little leverage as possible. This was graphically shown in the year that Britain had 3 Tory prime ministers last year. So when the wrong choice was made by the electors, a coup was organised basically by people around Sunak and in the sort of wider power structure, some say going as far as the World Bank in Washington, involving the bureaucracy. So, some features similar to what happened in 1688. When the Church of England and nobles kicked out the King James II. So it's a misnomer, I think, now to see the Conservative Party as conservative in any meaningful respect.
Yeah, I'll just speak about the American example because I'm not expert enough about the Tory party, but there are parallels. It was the late journalist Robert Novak who once said, God put the Republican Party on this planet to cut taxes, and other than that, they're not worth a darn. You might have put it more strongly than that. And the proof of this, and I'll limit myself to what's just one narrow aspect of it. I could go over all kinds of cultural issues and other things. But, we have our, as I call them, ministries of culture in America. National Endowment for Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, all these things. The amount of money is not that large, but you add it all up, it might be $1 billion a year. Maybe not quite that much. In America now, that's nothing, but okay. And Republican administrations typically appoint liberal Republicans to those to run these agencies who make no changes in their ideological direction in their grant making. And quite often, whenever a Republican president, like President Trump, tries to appoint somebody with a more oppositional mentality, the Democrats in Congress fight like hell to prevent that person's confirmation. Republicans never fight about these positions when there's a Democratic president, or even when their own president just names somebody they pick out of a phone book. So there's an asymmetry in the level of commitment and understanding why these cultural issues and even just the things like funding are worth fighting about. And that's, again, proof of Robert Novak's a point that once you get past tax cut, Republicans don't have much imagination for these kinds of things. So they lose.
I think I'd say two things that, in addition to the points made already, with which I agree. One is that the Conservative Party is a party in a two-party system, and that means it has to have, in order to win votes and recruit people to go into Parliament, it has to appeal to a fairly wide range of opinions. And of course, some are more conservative and some are more liberal. The second is that the Conservative Party starts as a parliamentary party and grows a national popular party from those roots up there downwards. The result is that there's a tradition which goes back to Arthur Balfour, really, of being proud of not paying attention to the views of the activists in the party. He said, I would as soon take orders from my valet as from the Conservative Party conference. But one political scientist of the left, Andrew Gamble, who did his first book was a study of the Conservative Party. And he reached the, I assume, reluctant conclusion that if you examine the debates in the Conservative Party conference, the rank and file activists from the floor had usually been more right than the party leaders. And I think that's certainly the case in relation to David Cameron and George Osborne. In what they, I think, thought they were doing was taking over a party that had been corrupted by Mrs. Thatcher, not so much economically, though they probably felt she was too rigid, but also because she was also a populist national figure too. There was that element in her politics which was important and which made her more popular. She won a war, for goodness sake, which is guaranteed to make a prime minister sort of popular and a national figure. And they thought that they were taking a party that was stuck in the past, looking backwards nostalgically, and turning it into a modern party that would read The Guardian and listen to the BBC and believe everything. And that was the key political decision they made. They would not attempt to quarrel with the tendencies in Britain's cultural life, which was described so well and comprehensively by Professor Gallagher today. Now, the problem is that did not represent the views and opinions of the rank and file. And that's why Brexit happened. That Brexit was the culmination of a number of things which were the expressions of discontent by the ordinary conservative in party institutions and otherwise, in more general sense, refusal to vote for the party on occasion, which they thought, once they had accomplished this cultural makeover, the party would be in a successful position to win. The fact is that they set up this list of A-list candidates they got in. Half of them left the party at the time of Brexit and in opposition to Boris Johnson's premiership, and became either started other parties or switched to Labour or the Lib Dems. The other half, well, some of them just became conservatives, and one or two were black or minority ethnic candidates. And it turned out they had quite conservative views, and that's true for Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman. They were brought in on those terms as well. So in other words, in addition to everything else, Cameron and Osborne didn't really know what the hell they were doing. And I think that was, and you can't run a party in active hostility to the views of its members effectively. You can do it for a while, but eventually you'll be rejected. So, and that I think is about to happen with the Conservative Party. Now, next question. Yes, Stephen.
Thank you. That was a terrific set of presentations. On my flight a few days ago from Vancouver, I didn't feel very sleepy, so I watched a classic British movie that is quite disturbing called A Clockwork Orange, which depicts a bleak dystopian Britain of the near future, at least as it was imagined in the early 70s. And it still has quite the power to shock, for those of you who have seen it. I guess what I've heard this evening, and what I've also perceived from recent visits to Britain, is that the Britain I love and first got to know quite well in the 80s is quite a long way down this path, a kind of bleak dystopian situation of the kind that has been so well described tonight. So my question really is, how does the UK get out of this? How does it get onto a better track, get off this train? How does it regenerate?
I take my hat off to you for inflicting Clockwork Orange on a night transatlantic flight. But, I mean, perhaps for the first time tonight, let me try to be upbeat. We have to remember that the people who are behind this kind of bizarre and scary transformation are not very impressive people. They are opportunistic, they are deluded, they are short-term in outlook, and they don't have a coherent game plan to completely subordinate Britain under a new iron heel, Jack London's book. And there are strong traditions of liberty in Britain, especially among the working classes. And so, if there was an attempt to criminalize large numbers of people because they were unable to or refused to obey the new climate edicts by drastically altering their lifestyles, then I think there would be strong resistance, solidarity type movements of the kind seen in Poland. So I would like to think that this is a mad period, a kind of Monty Python-esque period in the history of my country, and perhaps some decades after I have ceased to be around, some kind of normality will resume. But it will involve a titanic struggle, and there are, as I was saying to John, I think earlier, that there are people who are far more fanatical than the communist apparatchiks in countries like Hungary and Poland before 1989, and who will not give ground, and who might well quite happily contemplate acts of repression against their chief opponents. But I don't think they have the reach to take the country in a historically completely different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I've never really been a believer in cycles of history repeating themselves, but I'm starting to weaken on that. And one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is, the crime rate in America doubled in the 60s and then doubled again in the 70s and became a major political issue, mostly to the detriment of Democrats. One of Ronald Reagan's favorite lines back in the 60s when he was governor was, A liberal's idea of being tough on crime is giving longer suspended sentences. That's now the policy of so many of our prosecutors in the country. But even though it became a big issue, we didn't really get a handle on crime and start bringing the crime rate down until the 1990s. Now, there were some milestones along the way, but we sort of figured out what would work, this, and this, and I'll skip over all that. And it was a spectacular success and contributed to a renaissance of central cities in America. So big economic benefits from bringing down crime. And now we've thrown all that away. And I'm watching all this thinking, do we have to learn this all over again? Tom Wolfe, the great writer, used to say, America has to do a great relearning. And here and there, you see signs that, well, even liberal, very progressive San Francisco, where Republicans can meet in a phone booth, recalled their very left-wing district attorney by a huge landslide a year ago. Now he's down the hall from me at Berkeley Law, of course. And the left had to work very hard to prevent a recall petition from qualifying for the ballot in Los Angeles. So I think increasingly people are fed up, and I think that's going to turn around, but it's going to, once these social forces are unleashed, you can't turn on a dime. Once people get back to some sense about what works, it'll probably take a decade to bring it back down and fix our cities. And that's just one domain of all this.
Thank you. I'm afraid I failed to mention that we have another fellow who's recently joined us, Catherine Brodsky, is here. I welcome her. And she is a critic of Hollywood, a prolific blogger with over 1 million followers. So welcome, and I'm delighted we're here. You're here. Let me now turn it open to another question. Yes.
The recent news that GBTV beat the BBC in terms of its viewers. Any comments on that?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising. The BBC, in all departments, produces unappealing programs. Everyone was comforting themselves recently that there was one show that could not be turned into a kind of left liberal misery session, and that was Antiques Roadshow. and of course, they have used this popular weekend show, to beat the British slavery link for all its worth. I mean, the BBC is I have to be careful what I say, but let's say it generates huge emotions in the British public. I mean, the British used to love the BBC and regarded it as one of their national glories. But in the last third of a century, that has completely turned round. There is fury and indignation that people are actually going to prison, poor people, for being unable to pay the license for unwatchable TV products. Probably one of the most disliked figures is the regular presenter of the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, Nick Robinson, and he puts down the collapse in their listeners' ratings to the fact that, people have switched off politics, they become detached, so inevitably, whatever we do, we are the casualties of this. I mean, the BBC is very powerful. You could say at times it acts like a political party in its own right. It is able to mobilise huge influence in order to push a particular issue in a certain direction. And politicians, conservative ones, are afraid of the BBC, and they are hobbling themselves as long as they continue to allow this partisan institution to make the country a very unhappy one.
Yes. Could I just ask one question on that narrow point? The BBC not long ago, gained control of the BBC World Service. They gained it because previously it had been subsidized by the Foreign Office partly, and in order to sort of remove the taint of this Foreign Office subsidy, it was removed, and the BBC was given the World Service. Now, it lost its almost independent position within the BBC, and it's now become indistinguishable from the rest of the BBC. I wonder whether or not that couldn't be taken back from them. It's hard, because it would be hard for the BBC to actually make this an issue for popular indignation. And yet it would be a significant rebuke, because the BBC World Service editorial standards were higher than those of the BBC News Department.
Yes, I mean, on my travels in younger days, I used to feel proud at the way that the British slant on international developments was put across in a very kind of smooth, professional, wise and detached way. But do you mean giving it back to the Foreign Office?
No. Well, the Foreign Office, restoring the Foreign Office subsidy and restoring the greater independence it had before the Foreign Office subsidy disappeared. I mean, oddly enough, became far more biased as a result of losing the Foreign Office subsidy than it ever had been before. I mean, so I just think that it's I would like to see the restoration of the independence of the World Service because I think it would be a better service, and it would be an annoyance to the BBC. Anyway,
I agree.
Okay, Steve. Okay, another question. Yes. David Martin Jones.
I was very impressed by your argument, Tom, that maybe three areas you didn't address. One is, John sort of alluded to the fact that the Tory party can not forever ignore its members. I tend to disagree with that. I think since Blair arose in politics, and a lot of Britain's contemporary issues derive from Blair's huge capacity to alter all elements of the Constitution, and for then Cameron and May to follow the same kind of path. One of the key features of the party system that Blair recognised is that you didn't really need the working classes anymore for Labour. If Labour could become a media party, it could ignore its base. And similarly, the Conservatives have gone the same way. So political parties are merely sort of vacuous vehicles for a professional class of politicians that has emerged, who all share a common sort of set of values that you beautifully outlined. The other areas that relate to this is, secondly, key to Blairism was the breakup of the United Kingdom into divided kingdoms, and you're Scottish and I'm Welsh, and the consequences have been pretty diabolical for the idea of a United Kingdom, which came about as a result of civil war after 1688 and 1707. And consequent upon that has been, through Blairism, the opening up of migration on a massive basis that has altered the population of the country on the basis of an ideology you haven't mentioned, which is multiculturalism. I wondered if there was a comment from the three of you wise gentlemen on that.
Well, Tom.
I really don't know what the eventual impact of the demographic changes we are seeing rolling out in so many parts of Britain will be. I mean, there is hopeful news from the United States where Hispanic Americans, perhaps because of their family structures, economic outlook, are emerging as a conservative and sensible bloc in politics. I don't think new groups of voters will be easily controlled and turned into tools by radical progressives in politics. I think, it could lead to a lot of turbulence in which the state reveals its fragility and impotence. Turning to the territorial aspects of the United Kingdom, it is tragic that, low-grade, cynical, short-term, better stop there, politicians, have kind of upended the British Constitution and have engaged in, stunts, basically, that cause long-term damage. You see now in Spain there is a really immense crisis there under a very unscrupulous prime minister who has allied with some of the most dangerous elements in politics just so that he can remain in power for a couple of years. And his defenders cite the Northern Ireland example of giving amnesty to terrorists. Look, here is sensible, respectable Britain. They have led the way for us. So a lot of these awful gimmicks, resonate elsewhere. I don't think there will be any changes to the map of Britain. I don't think United Ireland is on the cards. Scotland, the nationalists have done their best to turn it into a failed state. If you want a kind of framework about how they have governed, look at post-colonial Africa in the 1960s, and you get plenty of examples. But Blair, is a figure who, surprisingly, he's not attracted that many biographers, considering the rampage that he did. Yeah.
Steve.
Well, just very briefly, there is a parallel in the United States that a lot of elected Republicans also hate large parts of the Republican Party base. You saw this 12 years ago or so with the Tea Party that was a spontaneous grassroots effort in opposition to a lot of the things Obama was doing. And then, of course, when Trump came along, no one saw that coming, completely disoriented, and they still can't cope with it. The other part you mentioned, multiculturalism, that's a term that has faded from use in the US. It's not gone, but it's been supplanted by diversity, means much the same thing. But then also colonialism. These things are joined in this way. In the abstract, when multiculturalism first became this explicit enthusiasm, I guess in the 1980s and 90s, in the abstract, it makes perfect sense. People should learn about other cultures. And that used to mean you would learn Italian or you'd learn Hungarian or something. That's never what it meant then. It's not what it means now. It means you must like all other cultures without really taking them seriously, but hate your own, right? And that's colonialism was a great sin, and you're not allowed to say, well, we've talked about it. This has been referenced a little bit. We were talking about it over coffee earlier. There's Bruce Gillies, this political scientist I know in Oregon, who's written a couple of articles in praise of colonialism or defense of some aspects of it. Well, they got withdrawn from the journals it appeared in because you simply cannot say that there were any good effects of colonialism. That is, since we're in the land of Scruton cafes, Roger Scruton, that is the culture of repudiation at work, and that's what multiculturalism came to mean, and it's still very strong in its substance, even if the name has faded a little.
Perhaps I will respond to David's challenge here, because I guess I don't believe that political parties have become irrelevant, and I guess I don't believe that in the case of the reason is I believe, as in the case of Brexit, that the Conservative Party was extremely influential. First of all, a steady group of people in Parliament, about, I would say, third openly and a larger group covertly made it plain they didn't want any further integration. And as moves towards it continued, they became more and more sympathetic to actually the idea of leaving. Secondly, when the Brexit result was passed and Mrs. May's government made it plain that she was going to pass the most diluted version of Brexit she could imagine, the Conservative rank and file rebelled. Before, and this is a key thing, before the European elections in 2019 gave a huge victory to Nigel Farage's Brexit party. Before that happened, the Conservative associations across England passed motions of no confidence in the Prime Minister. And they reached such a large number that the party was going to be obliged to call a national convention of the party in order to discuss the question, which May was plainly going to lose. And so the party had already achieved, in a sense, her resignation before the European election result, in which they got, I think, 8% of the national vote. But the party recovered quite quickly when she was replaced by Boris, who did represent popular opinion in the party and outside it. What has been interesting to me has been the determined way in which both the political opponents, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, and rank and file centrist and even some conservative correspondents have kept insisting that the Brexit case was a simple case of a row within the Conservative Party in which the rest of the country wasn't involved. When you consider the result of the Brexit referendum demonstrated the majority opinion in both parties was to leave. Now, you might say in a different day it might have been a different balance of opinion. But as several perceptive commentators said before the vote, well, we think the government will win the Brexit referendum. We think it's going to happen. But afterwards, you can't treat the people who wanted Brexit as a small, unrepresentative and eccentric minority. It's plainly a centrist opinion. But the left has continued denying that palpable fact ever since. And it suggests to me the degree to which parties simply lie and obfuscate is a factor in all politics, but at the same time, it's one that can be resisted and overcome. And I think that's something to remember as we're entering what I think we all seem to agree is the dark corridor in the next few years. I want to thank two brilliant speakers who've made fundamentally gloomy discussion extremely entertaining, and that is something I'm grateful for, because we're going to have to be grateful for that kind of thing a lot in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming.